In 1763, King George III's subjects in North America foresaw a happy and prosperous future in the British Empire. British authorities had spent time and money protecting the colonies during the recent French and Indian War, and colonists expected to prosper as they moved to the rich lands of the West. That euphoria faded quickly. To prevent colonists from stirring up another expensive war with indigenous Americans, King George III prohibited the colonists from crossing the Appalachian Mountains. Then, to pay for the recent war, the king's ministers pushed a number of revenue laws through Parliament, including, in 1765, the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act hit virtually everyone in the North American colonies by requiring the payment of a tax on printed material. What Parliament saw as a way to raise money to pay for an expensive war, one which benefited the colonists after all, colonial leaders saw as an abuse of power. The British government had placed a direct tax on the colonists without their consent. More than money was at stake. The fight over taxes tapped into a struggle that had been going on in England for more than a century over a profound question of human governance. Could the king be checked by the people? When news of the Stamp Act arrived in Boston, a group of dockhands, sailors, and workers who called themselves the Sons of Liberty took to the streets, warning colonists that their rights as Englishmen were under attack. Lawyer John Adams recognized that the Sons of Liberty were changing the political equation. He wrote, "They tinge the minds of the people. They impregnate them with the sentiments of liberty. They render the people fond of their leaders in the cause and averse and bitter against all opposers." The Sons of Liberty began writing letters to like-minded friends across the colonies, informing them about local events. As similar organizations sprang up across the colonies, people were spurred to action. By 1766, the Stamp Act was costing more to enforce than it was producing in revenue, and Parliament agreed to end it. But it explicitly claimed full power and authority to make laws and statutes to bind the colonies in all cases whatsoever. News of new taxes reached Boston in late 1767. The Massachusetts legislature promptly circulated a letter to the other colonies opposing taxation without representation and standing firm on the colonists' right to equality in the British Empire. The Sons of Liberty called for boycotts on taxed goods and broke into the warehouses to enforce the boycotts, while women demonstrated their support by weaving their own cloth and abandoning tea for coffee. Colonists in Boston seemed on the edge of revolt, crowded together as they were on what was almost an island joined to the mainland by a spit of land known as Boston Neck. When British officials sent troops to restore order, rather than calming the town, fights erupted between locals and the British regulars. In March 1770, British soldiers fired into a crowd of angry men and boys harassing them. They wounded 6 and killed 5, including Crispus Attucks, a black man who became the first to die in the attack. Paul Revere's instantly famous engraving turned the fight into the Boston Massacre. Parliament removed the British troops to an island in Boston Harbor and got rid of all but one of the new taxes, the one on tea, keeping the issue of taxation without representation on the table. Then, in May 1773, Parliament gave the East India Tea Company a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies, thus establishing Parliament's right to impose a tax. In response, local leaders posted a citizen guard on Griffin's Wharf to make sure tea could not be unloaded. On December 16, 1773, men dressed as indigenous Americans boarded 3 merchant ships. They broke open 342 chests of tea and dumped the valuable leaves overboard. Parliament closed the port of Boston, stripped the colony of its charter, flooded soldiers back into the town and demanded payment for the tea. Colonists promptly organized the Massachusetts Provincial Congress and took control of the colony. They stockpiled supplies and weapons in nearby Concord and called for towns to create Minutemen who could fight at a moment's notice. In April, British officials ordered Military Governor General Thomas Gage to arrest colonial leaders Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who had left Boston for the nearby town of Lexington. The Massachusetts Provincial Congress that now controlled the colony had stored military supplies next to Lexington, in Concord, and seizing both the men and the munitions, officials hoped, would end what they saw as a rebellion. Boston men, including Paul Revere, were watching the soldiers, but didn't know if they would leave Boston by way of the narrow Boston Neck or row across the harbor to Charlestown. Revere had rung the bells in the steeple of the Old North Church as a teenager. He told friends in Charlestown that if the British went out by water, we would show 2 lanterns in the North Church steeple, and if by land, 1, as a signal, so messengers could raise the alarm on the road to Lexington and Concord. Revere's childhood friend John Pulling Jr., a wealthy sea captain, and the church's caretaker, Robert Newman, were both Sons of Liberty. On the night of April 18th, Revere learned the troops were on the water, told Pulling, then rowed across the harbor to Charlestown to ride to Lexington himself. Pulling and Newman climbed the steeple, flashed the lanterns, and climbed back down. Messengers in Charlestown had seen the signal, but so had British soldiers. On the night of April 18, 1775, Revolutionary leader Dr. Joseph Warren urged William Dawes and Paul Revere to ride to Lexington to warn Samuel Adams and John Hancock that British soldiers were coming. Dawes crossed the Boston Neck just before soldiers closed the town. Revere rode to Charlestown, borrowed a horse, and headed out. The 2 riders alerted the houses along their different routes. They converged in Lexington, warned Adams and Hancock, and then set out for Concord, where the Massachusetts Provincial Congress had stored arms and ammunition. As they rode, young Dr. Samuel Prescott, who was courting a girl from Lexington and was headed back to his home in Concord, came up behind them. He joined them to alert the town, pointing out that his neighbors would pay more attention to a local man. About halfway to Concord, British soldiers caught them. They ordered Revere to dismount, took his horse, and turned him loose to walk back to Lexington. Dawes escaped, but his horse bucked him off, and he too headed back to Lexington on foot. But Prescott jumped his horse over a stone wall and got away to Concord. The 3 men had done their work. Local residents spread the news that the regulars were coming. By the time Revere made it back to the house where Adams and Hancock were hiding, militiamen were converging on Lexington Green. On that chilly, dark morning in April, so were the British soldiers. When they marched onto the Lexington town green in the darkness just before dawn, the British soldiers found several dozen militiamen waiting for them. An officer ordered the men to disperse, and they began to mill around, some of them leaving. And then, just as the sun was coming up, a gun went off. No one knew who pulled the trigger: a soldier, a militiaman, a bystander, or even someone drinking in the nearby tavern. But the soldiers opened fire. When the locals realized the soldiers were firing not just powder as a warning, but lead musket balls, most ran. 8 colonists were killed, and another dozen, including enslaved militiaman Prince Estabrook, were wounded. The outnumbered colonists fell back, and about 300 regulars marched on Concord to destroy the guns and powder there. But news of the arriving soldiers and the shooting on Lexington Town Green had spread through the colonists' alarm and muster communication network, and militiamen from as far away as Worcester were either in Concord or on their way. By mid-morning, the regulars were outnumbered and in battle with about 400 militiamen. They pulled back to join the main body of British troops still in Lexington. Ralph Waldo Emerson would later call the conquered battle the shot heard round the world. By the time British officers ordered the regulars back to Boston, they had been awake for most of 2 days and had marched about 18 miles to get to Concord. Dragging their wounded on carts, they set out for Boston. But militiamen had converged on their route and outnumbered them by more than 2 to 1. As the regulars traveled the battle road back to Charlestown in military formation, militiamen fired at them, not in organized lines as soldiers were accustomed to, but in the style they had learned from indigenous Americans, shooting from behind trees, houses, and the glacial boulders littered along the road. This way of war used the North American landscape to their advantage, enabling them to pick off British officers, dressed in distinct uniforms, first. One regular recalled, "The country was full of hills, woods, stone walls, and so on, which were all lined with people who kept an incessant fire upon us, as we did too upon them, but not with the same advantage, for they were so concealed there was hardly any seeing them." The imbalance of the battle road showed in the casualty lists. By the end of the day, 73 regulars were dead, 174 were wounded, and 26 were missing. 49 colonists were dead, 41 wounded, and 5 missing. By the next morning, more than 15,000 militiamen surrounded the town of Boston. The colonists had begun to feel their power. After the battles of Lexington and Concord, militiamen laid siege to Boston. In June, British officials decided to seize the high ground around the town so their guns could control Boston Harbor, Dorchester Heights south of the town, Charlestown Heights to the north. The militia learned of the plan. On the night of June 16th, 1,200 soldiers quietly occupied Charlestown's Bunker Hill and Breed's Hill. Using shovels and pickaxes, they dug trenches and built an earthen fort on Breed's Hill. When the sun came up on June 17th, British officers saw the fortifications. As Navy ships bombarded the fort, General Thomas Gage ordered troops across the Charles River to make an assault. While the regulars waited for the tide to rise enough that they could cross, more militiamen joined the forces dug in on the hill. Then, mid-afternoon, the regulars attacked. The militiamen were inexperienced, but protected by the fort. They held their fire until the regulars got close, holding them back until their ammunition ran out. When the regulars charged, the two sides fought with bayonets until the militiamen were forced to retreat over Bunker Hill. Technically a British victory, the Battle of Bunker Hill was costly. More than 1,000 regulars died or were wounded, while the militiamen lost about 450. Crucially, the Patriots had held their own against the British Army, giving heart to those resisting the British government. As events in Boston intensified, in mid-June the Second Continental Congress, meeting in Philadelphia, resolved to form a Continental Army for defense. They elected Virginia planter and military veteran George Washington as commander-in-chief. 3 days later, the bloody Battle of Bunker Hill convinced colonists they were not helpless. Washington took up headquarters in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and set to work training the unruly militiamen into an army. Meanwhile, Colonel Benedict Arnold of Connecticut and Ethan Allen, the leader of the Green Mountain Boys, marched troops to Fort Ticonderoga in New York and seized the cannons and military supplies there. Over the winter, an expedition under Colonel Henry Knox used boats, horses, and oxen to move 60 tons of munitions from Fort Ticonderoga to Boston. On the night of March 4, 1776, 2,500 Continental troops moved the munitions to the top of Dorchester Heights. This position commanded Boston Harbor from the south, thus endangering the British Navy ships. On March 8th, British General William Howe offered to leave the town peacefully if the Continentals agreed not to shoot. Washington agreed. On March 17th, the regulars left Boston by sea, taking more than 1,000 Loyalists with them to Halifax, Nova Scotia. 250 years later, Massachusetts still celebrates Evacuation Day, which conveniently coincides with St. Patrick's Day. Although they were preparing for war, colonial leaders still hoped for peace. In July 1775, 3 months after the battles of Lexington and Concord, the Second Continental Congress signed the Olive Branch Petition. It pledged loyalty to King George III and blamed the king's ministers for abusing the colonies. By the time the petition made it to England in late August, the king had declared the colonies to be in open rebellion. He refused even to receive the petition. As Washington recruited a naval force to defend the coastline and called for the British colonies in Canada and Bermuda to join the cause of virtue and liberty, colonists began to talk of independence, but they weren't yet ready to leave the British Empire. Then, in January 1776, Thomas Paine's book Common Sense took the fight directly to King George. Paine called for independence from England and for the colonists to create a new kind of government, a democratic republic. Common sense swept the colonies. The fight that had started in 1765 over the question of whether the king could be checked by the people had given the colonists an entirely new, radical answer. On July 4, 1776, they declared that people had the right to be treated equally before the law, and they had the right to govern themselves.